All right, we're in Genesis chapter 25, looking at the story of Jacob and Esau. And the first question is, what was included in the birthright of the firstborn according to Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, and this passage also in Genesis? Let's look first at Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 through 17. Won't read all the verses, but you can look at them in your own time, but I'll just read verse 17. It says, "He must acknowledge the son of his unloved wife as the firstborn." And this is how he does that: by giving him a double share of all he has. That son is the first sign of his father's strength. The right of the firstborn belongs to him. So here we have the right, the birthright of the firstborn belonging to him. That firstborn right here, that birthright of the firstborn, is a double share of all he has. But this is definitely talking about materially. All of the father's physical assets, we could say in our modern terminology, would go, the double portion of them would go to the firstborn, and then the subsequent children would have to split the rest. And so this is a part of the birthright that was due to Esau, and the birthright that was taken, or given, I should say, to Jacob. The other part of that we want to look at is in Genesis chapter 48, verses 17 through 19. And really, for the context, I do want to include verse 14. This is where Jacob, or Israel, is about to die. And before he dies, he wants to bless the sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, who were born to Joseph in Egypt. Verse 14 says, "But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head." So he's reaching here to cross his hand, to put his right hand on Ephraim's head, who was younger, and puts his left hand on Manasseh's head, who was the firstborn. And so instead of using his right hand, which of course is the symbol of this strength, instead of using his right hand to bless the firstborn, he uses his right hand to bless the second child, the one who was not the firstborn. And then he gives the blessing in verses 15 and 16. Then verse 17, Joseph wasn't pleased with this, and he says, why did you do this? Basically, because this one is the firstborn. And he tells him to put his right hand, this is verse 18, on Manasseh's head, who was actually the firstborn. But verse 19, his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too, the actual firstborn, will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." That last part there, he's saying that the descendants of the not firstborn will become a group of nations. And this was the blessing that Joseph was expecting to be passed on to the firstborn. So this promise, which is a promise that had been inherited from Abraham, Isaac to Jacob, this promise, this spiritual possession, was also expected to be passed to the firstborn. So this is also included in that birthright. The birthright, of course, includes the physical, the material possessions, yes, but it also includes the inheritance of the promises, the spiritual inheritance that God had given to Abraham. So going back to Genesis 25, this is what was at hand here when Esau gives his birthright to Jacob. Number two, would these have been profitable to Esau in the present or in the future, the physical and the spiritual blessings? Well, the physical blessings, of course, would not have been profitable in that day when he met his brother and asked for the porridge or pottage. He would not have received the material blessings until the death of his father, and the spiritual blessing, if he actually wouldn't even receive those after, because Abraham hadn't received them, Isaac hadn't received them, Jacob hadn't received them, and it wasn't until long after that the seed would really become the multitude, and they wouldn't actually even receive the land. And so the blessings, the promises, these things were way off. And so for him, the profit of this right of the firstborn was definitely way off in the future and not in the present. The next question is the reverse. The meal that he was asking for, would that have been profitable to Esau in the present or in the future. Of course, that would be very profitable to him in the present and of no value to him really in the future. So number 4 has a little play on this and says, go ahead and fill in the blanks using lesser and greater. There are 2 ways actually that are valid for filling in the blanks. You could say Esau's choice was between lesser weight for lesser value and greater weight for greater value. The other way you could say that would be Esau's choice was between greater weight for greater value and lesser weight for lesser value. But the emphasis is obvious that if he wanted something that was of less value, then he would have less time to wait for it. And that's what he chose here. He chose the meal that was not much time that he had to wait for. He didn't have to wait for his father to die. He didn't have to wait for his descendants to inherit the blessings. He just had to wait for the bowl to be dished out. Less weight, but it's of far less value, that meal, versus the physical blessings even, and more importantly, the spiritual blessings, the spiritual blessings and promises that have been given to Abraham. Greater weight, however, for those things. This goes to the next question. Did he regret his decision? And that's very interesting, that usually it's the case where, I'm sure it's happened to you as it's happened to me, that when we make a decision of misprioritizing something, of we put something of lesser value above something that's of greater value, and we make this mistake, usually immediately after, as I've experienced and I'm sure you've experienced, we regret it. We realize what we've done. We realize we've sacrificed something of greater value for something of lesser value, and then we're sorry. But the verse says, and this is the last verse of the chapter, verse 34, then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. After his stomach was full, after he was no longer starving and needing the food, he still didn't regret it. Hence the last verse of the chapter, so Esau despised his birthright. That's the conclusion of the passage. That you can see that he makes this terrible, grave mistake, and then doesn't even regret it after. Because even when his belly was full, even when he had received this temporary, this immediate gratification, he still did not regret losing his birthright. And so the passage, that's what Moses, the author here, is saying, look, he despised his birthright. And this now goes to ourselves. And that's the 6th question. What does it say about how he valued what he lost? But the 7th question, how are we tempted to make this mistake? How are we tempted to make mistakes similar to Esau's mistake? And what can help us overcome? I think the first and most obvious way that we can overcome is to do what Esau didn't do. Look and see the value of what he was sacrificing. Think about it. Meditate on it. It seems that Jacob had placed a high value on this birthright. Jacob had placed seemed to be all-consuming here. His brother just comes and says he's hungry, he wants some food, and Jacob seizes on this opportunity to get this birthright. He likely had been thinking about this birthright and desiring it. Maybe not so much for the financial gain of it, not so much for the physical blessings, but likely for those spiritual blessings, especially when we look at Jacob later in his life. He talks about God being the God of his father Abraham, the God of his father Isaac, and then his own God. And he had likely looked and seen the way that Abraham trusted God, the way that Isaac trusted God. And he wanted that. He wanted to lead his family in the ways of the Lord. And so he had a higher value on this birthright. And so when we're faced with this challenge of prioritizing something that's of less importance over something that's of greater importance, of greater value, we can look and remember, what is the value of this thing that I'm sacrificing? Is it worth it? Is this temporary pleasure? Is this temporary enjoyment? Is this temporary good thing, fun time, whatever it is this temporary thing of greater value than what I may be sacrificing later? And this comes in all forms. This definitely and most directly, of course, applies to our salvation. What could be more important than our salvation? In the words of Jesus, what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? What can be of greater value than our eternal salvation? And what are we willing to sacrifice to have that salvation? What have we placed that salvation of the utmost importance and saying we're not going to let anything come, and anything that comes in the way of that, we are going to sacrifice it that we may win Christ and may be able to have that true relationship with him that grants us salvation. But also, aside from salvation, it's just other things. We may still be saved, but there's still a lot of hardships, a lot of difficulties that sometimes Christians, even Christians who are being saved, who will be saved, Christians endure, as we see in the life not of Esau, but of Jacob. Jacob endured great loss in his life, many challenges because of his own poor decisions, because he placed something above. He did in this case here. We see when he, not in this case, sorry, but in the case of lying to his father, he placed his ambition to get that blessing, to secure that blessing. He placed it on higher importance than maintaining a good relationship with his dear brother, with Esau. Yes, Esau had his problem, but it was still his brother. And he deceived his father to steal this from his brother, not trusting that God could fulfill his word to give it to him in his time. And so, taking that thing of lesser value, he lost so many things of greater value. He lost decades of time with his brother Esau. He lost the relationship with his brother Esau. He lost decades of time with his father. He never saw the face of his mother again. This didn't jeopardize his salvation, but this taking something of lesser value, he lost so many things of greater value. So many things of greater value. And this again is the case, can be the case in our life. No, we may not lose our eternal salvation, but we may face so many hardships, so many difficulties if we make this mistake of Esau and sacrifice what is of greater value for what is of lesser value. So let's pray. Let's seek God. Let's look to him to help us to have that higher value placed on the right things, to prioritize things appropriately, and then walk in harmony with those priorities, that we may have the abundant and full life that Jesus desires for us.